Hey guys, today we are doing something a little different than usual. We are going to be demonstrating all of the projectile melee weapons. Now I went to a lot of effort to get these, so I hope you enjoy this video. I did get some help from a friend, but these are all 100% legitimate. I did not cheat. There was no cheating involved. That's just, I wouldn't do that. I also have every melee armor here, but that's not what we're talking about today. Now, I do have some really good melee gear on. This isn't concerned with base damage so much as like how you get them and how cool they are and things. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because for all my playthroughs, I'm a melee player at heart. I love the high defense. I love the I love that you don't have to use ammo or manage mana, but most of all, I love the projectiles. So let's get right into it. So the Ice Blade is the weakest projectile melee weapon, but it's the easiest to get, and it's one of the 4 available in pre-hard mode. Now, it does have auto swing, which is kind of nice, and all it does is it just shoots a projectile. It doesn't pierce, but it's reasonably good if you can get it early on. I think the base damage is something like 17, something there. And the Enchanted Sword is the hardest to get in pre-hard mode, and you will not get it unless you are actively trying. Or if you get really lucky and happen to get a sword shrine that spawns above ground. Because if they don't spawn above ground, you need a good light source that can go through blocks. Now, it's probably the best overall, except it's very hard to get. It's not as easy to get as some of the other ones. It does not pierce, but it does reasonably good damage. And it's pretty good if you can get it early on. Now the Star Fury, not Star Rat, sorry, that's a different one. The Star Fury summons a star from above. It works differently than most projectiles, and now you can see it here. It does not have auto swing. It does pretty good damage. It does, I think, more than the Enchanted Sword. Was it? No, it's less. It's less. But it's easier to get. Now, as you can see, it can't go through solid blocks, so if you're in an enclosed space, it's not very effective. But it is really easy to get. Now, the Beekeeper drops from the Queen Bee, and you might get it if you're not trying. Most of these you have to be trying. You're not going to get them by accident, unless you're trying to get something else from an ice chest, which is where you get the Ice Blade. And, oh wait, I've been forgetting to tell you. And that you get in sky chests on floating islands. Now the Beekeeper does have auto swing, and it looks like the projectiles don't work on target dummies. So I'm going to activate these. I set up some enemy statues to demonstrate some of them. It does have a small chance to inflict confusion, and as you can see, it summons bees, which will attack enemies. Now let's turn this off before it spawns it. Great. Maybe I should have not put it on a timer. But, oh well, too late for that now. Now, next up we have the hard mode ones. These are the ones available before defeating any mechanical bosses, but after defeating the Wall of Flesh. First we have the Frostbrand. It's an upgraded version of the Ice Blade, essentially. It's easiest to get. It drops from Ice Mimics. It does have auto swing, and it does pierce, and it does much more damage than the Ice Blade. It's very good if you can get it early on. And then there is the Icicle, which works. It's a sort of a unique weapon. Most of these weapons are swords, but some are spears, some are projectile only, flails, yo-yos, all sorts of things. But this one is kind of unique because there's nothing quite like it. I mean, there's the Deathsicle, but both of those are unique. So, it does not have auto swing. What it does is it shoots a projectile that spins around. Unlike the Deathsicle, it does not go through blocks, and it has a limited amount of pierce. Now, it does pretty good damage, and it's an alternative to the Ice Blade. They're both reasonably easy to get. This has a random chance to drop from various enemies in the hard mode ice biome. The underground ice biome, of course. All the good stuff is in the underground. Then there's the Shadowflame Knife. It's one of 3 things that drops from the Shadowflame Summoner in the hard mode Goblin Invasion. It's sort of like the Magic Knife, which is a magic weapon, but it's melee, of course, and it does not cost mana. Also, it does have auto throw. Now, if you'll see, it doesn't bounce off blocks, but it does bounce off enemies, and it does inflict the a flame debuff. Now, if you can get it to hit multiple enemies, but it's more difficult, it doesn't exactly pierce, but it does ricochet. But it does not bounce off of blocks. Next up is the Beam Sword, which is essentially an upgraded version of the Enchanted Sword, and it's one of the ones that shoots a sword-shaped projectile. They're limited. Even though it is upgraded, it does not have auto swing, and like most sword-shaped projectiles, it does not pierce. However, it does really good damage. Like it does more damage than the Frostbrand, and it's good if you can get it. The next one is available only in Crimson Worlds. Only in Crimson Worlds. And it's one of the ones that only has an effect once you hit, and it looks like this one does work on target dummies. But once you hit, it shoots a projectile that bounces, it ricochets, but it inflicts Ichor, which is really good for melee players. Now this might sound really strong, but if you consider that you can make the Flask of Ichor, which works with any melee weapon, it's not quite as impressive. But it is one of the first projectile melee weapons that you can obtain. It's very easy to fish in a Crimson biome. Next up, we have the ones available after defeating one mechanical boss. First is the Hamush, which, even without a bad modifier, I would not recommend using as a weapon. It's a hammer, but technically it does have projectiles. I don't know why you don't use this as a weapon, but you could, theoretically, if you want to. Now, next up is the Mushroom Spear, which actually is a good weapon, and it's the first projectile spear you can get. Now, what it does is it actually leaves. The projectile doesn't go that far, but it can actually hit through blocks. Now, next up, we have another projectile spear, which is very recently added. You get it from the ogre in the Olin's army. Now, it's another one that only summons a projectile when it hits enemies, and it's not quite a spear. If you see, it's sort of swinging around, but it functions similarly. And it is reasonably good if you can get it. It's a pretty good spear. Basically, any spear that's projectile is okay, because there's so few of them, and spears are so nice to have in some situations. Now, next up we have the Chlorophyte Claymore, which it shoots orbs. And they are affected by gravity after a while, but they do pierce, and it's a reasonably good projectile melee weapon. You can get it right after you beat all 3 mechanical bosses once you craft the Drax. Now, this is actually should be in a different order because the Chlorophyte Claymore is better. The Chlorophyte Saber is honestly kind of useless, because it's not as good as the Chlorophyte Claymore. It can go through blocks, but the thing is, the Chlorophyte Partisan, which is the spear, actually can do the same thing, and wait, I think it does more damage. I'm pretty sure it does. 65. This isn't the base damage, this is with 67. Yeah, this is better. And so this does not have auto swing, I think, but it is better than the Chlorophyte Saber. Why would you make that? It's obviously inferior, even though it can go through blocks, because it's much shorter range and it does much less damage. Those are all just, you can craft them from Chlorophyte. These 2 weapons I forgot to mention, you buy them from the Truffle, obviously. I hope most of you know that. You're probably pretty knowledgeable at Terraria. I just thought this would be interesting, because I wanted to show off that I did get everyone legitimately. But anyway, next is the Death Sickle, and this is a more powerful version of the Icicle. It drops from Reapers, or it has a chance to. It's not guaranteed. During the once you've killed all 3 mechanical bosses, they spawn during the solar eclipse. Before that, solar eclipses are kind of useless because they don't have any real loot. Now, it does have limited pierce, but much more pierce than Icicle, and it can go through blocks. So that's the nice thing about it. Next up is the True Knight's Edge. Now, while it does do more damage than the True Excalibur, it's slower, so it does less damage per second. It does not have auto swing, so you have to click continuously, but it does have a unique sword, and of course it does not pierce. Like all sword shape, almost all, it does not pierce. Now, the True Excalibur does much less damage, but it has much higher DPS, because you see the projectiles are much faster, but they cover much less wide area, which has advantages and disadvantages. For one thing, they're less likely to hit the target, but they can fit through gaps. Next up is the Terra Blade, which is really good. It used to be the most powerful. It's the first sword-shaped projectile weapon that actually pierces. And it has auto swing, which I think it's the only one other than the enchanted sword to have that. Next is the Seedler, which is kind of interesting. It doesn't do all that much damage. It drops from Plantera. It's hard to get though because Plantera has so many drops. Most drops of any ball is tied with Queen Bee. Unique drops anyway. But anyway, it does on impact, or if it after a certain amount of time, it does shatter and explode, and the shrapnel will hit enemies. So it's interesting because of how it functions. It's not necessarily more powerful, but it does function in an interesting way. Next up is the Flower Pile, and this only looks like it only works on actual enemies. So if you see it actually shoots at enemies. It's hard to see. I had trouble seeing it for a while because I've never really used it before. But it actually shoots petals at enemies. It's a much weaker version of the Flare-On, which drops some Duke Fishron. But you can keep it out, so you can fire it continuously. Unlike the Flare-On, which functions more like the chain knife and things, where it just goes out and comes back immediately. Next up is the Butcher's Chainsaw, which is not all that good. It does very good damage, and it does spray sparks everywhere. But the problem is it's so short range, and the projectiles only work when it hits something. And a lot of things you'll see that's an issue for them because range is important. Now, if that doesn't work, see this is another one where it only makes the projectiles once you hit something. But if you see, they'll start floating in from there. There's little pumpkins, and well, it looks like they can't go through blocks. Or wait, they can, but they don't pierce, and they're hitting those target dummies. So if I come down here, let me turn off the timer. If I come down here, you'll see the pumpkin projectiles are attacking the enemies, and they automatically target. Now, originally this was one of the strongest swords, but the Terrorblade is actually better, even though you can obtain it earlier. Now, next is the Christmas Tree Sword. Now, this is, like several of these weapons, post-Plantera, these are the post-Plantera ones. The problem with them, that drops... Okay, so I've been forgetting. Those first two drop from Plantera. This one drops from, the Butcher during the post-Plantera Solar Eclipse. This drops from the Pumpkin. This drop has a chance to drop from the Everscream, which is the Christmas tree boss during the Frost Moon. Now, the problem with a lot of these is that Terrorblade is available before you kill Plantera, so there is a stronger thing available earlier, which kind of cuts down on the usefulness a lot. But if you don't feel like getting the Terrorblade, or if I don't know, if you don't feel like getting the Terrorblade, because it is kind of a pain to get, and it is replaceable later, all of these are okay. It does not have auto swing, it does not pierce, but it does reasonably good damage. Next is the strongest spear in the game. Well, the strongest actual spear. The Daybreak, I guess you could consider to be stronger, but it's not technically a spear. This from the Frost Queen, it shoots a projectile, and the projectile actually drops snowflakes. Let me go show you. It can blanket an area in projectiles. You see those? They are affected by wind, apparently. Next up is the Flare-On, which, like I told you, is a stronger version of the Flower Pile. It functions more like a chain knife, and it spawns bubbles that are homing. Next up is the Scourge of the Corruptor, which if we turn on this timer, you'll see these little things homing on enemies. Oh, wait, I'm not supposed to take that yet. And lastly, for post-Plantera, there's the Vampire Knives, which actually heal you for damage you deal. This is available by getting the Corruption Key. That's available by getting the Crimson Key. This is dropped by Duke Fishron. Now, if you'll see here, it heals you for a fraction of the damage you deal. Next up, we have the up next we have the post-golem weapons. We're going to move on to them. So up first is Influx Waver, which drops from the Martian Saucer and the Martian Madness Invasion. As you can probably tell by the style and the name and all that stuff, it does really good damage. It's the best pre-Lunatic Cultist melee weapon in terms of damage. It's good if you can get it. And actually, if you use on actual enemies, it will have an interesting effect. Just spawn a couple. Okay, so if you, obviously this will kill him on hit, but if you hit an enemy, it will come back and target the other enemies up to several times. I don't know how many times exactly, but most of these weapons have an interesting properties. So up next is the Flying Dragon. It's the other sword, really good sword. Wait, does this actually do less damage? No, it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, this does less damage. The Influx Waver does not do less damage than this. So, it has good pierce. It can go through blocks, but it has limited range. As you can see, the projectiles will disappear, so, like, right off the edge of the screen, they disappear. So... And next is an interesting one. This isn't quite like any other weapon. So, like several of the ones from the Old Ones Army, these are both dropped from Betsy in the Tier 3 Old Ones Army. Like several of the Old Ones Army weapons, it functions differently from other weapons. It has two functions. First, if you left click, like other weapons, it has a left click and a right click button. If you left click, it spins around you and does lots of damage. If you're facing off against a bunch of enemies, it's really good. And in general, it's good at targeting lots of enemies at once. But if you right-click, it shoots out 3 projectiles which spread, and on hitting an enemy or on hitting a block, it shoots them randomly. On hitting an enemy or block, they actually burst. It's sort of like the Electro Sphere Launcher, which is a range weapon. Or if you're in an open space and they don't hit anything, they will eventually just impact. They have a limit on how far they can go without impacting. So that's it for the post-golem. Now for the final ones, you're probably aware of these. These are some of the most well-known ones. So there's the Daybreak, which is sort of a spear. It's not quite because it doesn't actually have a spear, but I guess you could consider it a spear. So it actually deals a stacking debuff, which is also dealt by the Solar Eruption, but this one stacks. It's single target, and it's really effective, and it will deal 25 damage per second for each sphere you have in an enemy. So it deals damage over time, and the damage on it is quite good. This is crafted from solar fragments, of course, that you get from the solar pillar. Up next is the... Well, this has a bad modifier. I didn't really bother to get good modifiers. I just took whatever I had. But the Star Wrath is an upgraded version of the Star Fury, which I misspoke of earlier. And it's actually better than the Meow Mirror in the right situation. It has higher raw damage, because even though the weapon itself isn't that powerful, the projectiles deal twice the damage of the sword itself, and they come down really fast. Now they can go through blocks in some cases, but generally they don't work. Like sometimes they will come through blocks to get to the target, but not always. Then there's Meow Mirror, most famous sword, but I personally prefer the Star Wrath in the right situation. It's easier to pick up and use, because like the Star Wrath, it's very situational. Like it can be very good in the right situations, but it's harder to just if you just need to deal with an enemy real quick. The Meow Mirror is easier for that. Then there's the Terrarian, which if you have a yo-yo bag, and it has the highest DPS of any weapon in the game. And as you can see, if you look at my damage per second meter right there, that's a lot of damage. But yeah, and those 3 all drop from Moonlord, so you might have to do a bit of grinding if you want to get those. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this informational video. It's a little different from what we really do. But I had a good time doing it. I thought it was fun. So if you like the style of video, let me know. If you don't, you can let me know that too, and I won't do that anymore. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.